Good morning. Today is Thursday, January 30th, 2025. Before I begin, I just want to start by saying Baruch Hashem, thank God, and thank all those people who are responsible in one way or another. This morning, we learned of the freedom, the release of 8 hostages from Gaza. Agam Berger, a young woman we spoke about a couple of days ago, Arbel Yehud, Gadi Moses, and 5 hostages from Thailand were released this morning. Baruch Hashem, thank God. I hope to have more to say about this soon, but for now, I invite you to join me to acknowledge God's goodness and greatness in bringing this about. Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Thank God. In last week's Torah portion, God tells Moshe to perform miracles before Paro and to demand that Paro let the Jewish people leave Egypt. And God says, in last week's Parsha, Vani akshe eslev Paro, I will harden Paro's heart. So he will not relent, even in the face of devastating plagues, until the final 10th plague in our Torah portion, the Parsha Bo. And we find similar language in Paro's response to plague number 6 in last week's Torah portion, and in our Torah portion, plague number 8 and plague number 10, and there are 2 different phrases. Usually they're translated the same as God hardening the heart of Paro. One of the phrases is Vayechazek Hashem eslev Paro, v'lo shama alehem. God, usually translated as hardened Paro's heart, so that he did not listen to Moshe and Aaron asking him to let the Jews go free. But Vayechazek literally means to strengthen, but it's usually translated as hardening. God hardened his heart. And the other phrase that's used is Ani hichbadati es libo. Literally, that means God says, I weighed down, or usually translated, I hardened Paro's heart. And that leads to 2 very difficult and classic questions that have been discussed for centuries. First, if God caused Paro to refuse, it was not Paro's choice. And therefore, how could Paro bear any responsibility for refusing? How could he be punished for it? And second, why is this language different than what we find in the first 5 plagues, last week's Torah portion, where the Torah clearly says that it was Paro's choice, not God. Vayechazak lev Paro v'lo shama alehem. In the first 5, it says Paro hardened his heart. So why does it change from the first 5 to the second 5? Well, classic commentators give a range of different answers to this question. One is, the Rambam, Maimonides says this, that the loss of free will that Paro suffers in the second 5, where God caused him to not relent, to harden his heart, that was a punishment for Paro doing that on his own in the first 5. That is, God recognized that Paro had chosen freely to harden his heart, to refuse, and God closed the door of repentance to Paro in the second 5 by making it impossible for Paro to have free choice in the second 5, so he was punished for the first 5. That's what the Rambam says. Another way to understand this is the word vayichazek. And God, we translate that as God hardened Paro's heart, but literally, as I said to you before, vayichazek from chazak means God strengthened his heart. In other words, God did not take away Paro's free will. God, on the contrary, preserved the strength of Paro to be willing to choose to refuse in the face of the overwhelming disasters that were hitting Egypt. Meaning, it's a different situation, but it's a similar idea. If you, God forbid, if someone is being tortured, they'll say anything. Doesn't make it true. And we know there's a lot of evidence that things that are said under torture, leaving aside all the other issues, often they're just not true because a person will say anything to stop torture. So a person could be expected to say anything in the face of these overwhelming disasters that are occurring to Paro and to his nation. And what God does is, no, God gives Paro the strength to be able to say, I don't want to do it. He strengthens him so that he doesn't feel that he's being tortured and he can use his own free choice to decide not to do it. But you notice that all of these approaches refuse to accept the idea that a person's free will can be taken away, because that is one of the fundamental beliefs that we have. And the Rambam explains, if we don't have free choice, if we don't have the ability to choose either right or wrong in every single situation without exception, then there's no point to commandments and prohibitions, because we're just acting the way we're predetermined to act. We don't have free choice. We're being forced. So there's no way to reward a person for doing something that is good, and there's no way to punish a person for doing something that's wrong, because it's not their fault. There's no free will. And since that is a fundamental, that God does reward and punish and hold us accountable, it cannot be that free will is taken away from a person. So the commentators come up with the approaches that they come up with. But Rabbi Jonathan Sacks points out that this assertion of ultimate freedom of choice has become more problematic in modern times through the accumulation of challenges to this approach, to this belief. Karl Marx famously said that history is formed by economic forces, not by individuals making choices. Dr. Freud argued that we act based on unconscious drives, that we're not even aware of why we make the decisions that we make. And recently, neuroscientists have shown through advanced scanning that our brains can register a decision before we are consciously aware of it. And we're learning more today how the patterns of behavior, as they are repeated, can become part of the architecture of the brain. For example, through addiction. A person does something a certain number of times, and it becomes impossible for them, almost impossible for them, to stop doing it. So that the more often we behave in certain ways, the harder it is to break the habit. And so according to Rabbi Sacks, we now have a modern scientific way to explain the hardening taking place in Paro's heart. Because Paro establishes a pattern of behavior in the first 5 plagues, he habituates himself to refusing to let the Jews go free, and his repeated actions and decisions act as a sort of addiction to the point that he can't do something else. He can't make another choice. It's as if he has an addiction to this position of not letting the Jews go free. And the same is true of every habit, everything that we repeat on a frequent basis. Rabbi Sachs says almost all our structures, mental and social, tend to reinforce previous patterns of behavior. So our freedom diminishes every time we choose to fail it. In other words, freedom of choice is not a given. It's not absolute. We have to work for it, and as Paro shows, we can lose it. And just like a person who becomes addicted to drugs, to alcohol, to work, to anything, because we've made this choice so many times, it becomes a part of us, and then to change becomes all that much harder. And there is a very practical lesson that comes from this. And that is, and it applies to every single one of us, we need a mental mindset that pauses before beginning any significant action. And we need to be able to ask ourselves, should I do this the first time? May I do this the first time? There needs to be an internal narrative so that we can ask about any course of action the first time. Is this really who I am? Is this what I stand for? Because there's a very good chance that whatever I do and then repeat, the more I repeat it, the more it becomes part of me. And the more freedom of choice I lose over being able to change it. In other words, the beginning matters. Once we start moving in a certain direction, the window of opportunity for changing or redirecting our action, that window grows smaller and smaller. And while God, in our Torah portion and the end of last week's Torah portion, is acting to keep Paro resolute against permitting the Jews to leave, this is really, as Rabbi Sachs is understanding it, this is really an extension of Paro's earlier resistance to do the right thing, which sets this pattern that makes it harder and harder for Paro to change his mind. Just to share one example where setting off on a pattern leads to stubbornness and inability to change that causes tremendous, tremendous pain and suffering to others. This insight that was made by Keshet Starr, I've mentioned her to you many times. She's an incredible woman. She was the director of ORA, which is the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, an organization dedicated to helping women who are chained to marriages that are clearly over, but a husband refuses, for whatever reason, to give a get to his wife. And I've shared with you how much I admire Keshet and that we have worked together in the past and will continue to work together to help women in this terrible situation. And she writes that she sees on a regular basis the causes and the consequences of intractable and unreasonable stubbornness every day. Because if a person has chosen, let's say a husband, has chosen not to give a get and becomes convinced that this is the right thing, even when objectively it's clear that he should be giving his wife a get and ending this marriage in the eyes of Jewish law. And it could be that a person will approach this recalcitrant spouse with very logical reasons why they should change their mind and give a get. But they don't sometimes because their hearts are hardened. And it becomes more and more difficult to get them to change their mind because they've set up this pattern. They've said no repeatedly. And it becomes almost like a type of addiction, that it's harder and harder for them to change their mind, even in the face of overwhelming pressure, which any reasonable person would say, okay, I'm going to give a get. But what this means in this specific example is the importance of encouraging a couple to do a get as soon as possible, as soon as it is clear that no resolution or reconciliation is possible and the marriage is clearly over. Obviously, that's the first step. But then the get should be arranged as soon as possible. Because if it's not done right away, over time, people become habituated to their opinion. And if a person said once, I'm not going to give a get, and then they repeat it, and then they repeat it, their hearts become hardened and they become intractable. And the window for change becomes smaller. And this is all just one example, a very serious example of this aspect of human psychology, that the beginning matters. The choice that we make at the beginning matters. And that's why, by the way, just, to introduce this again, this idea of a halachic prenup is so important, because what it does is it gets a couple before they are married, or after they're married, but before there is any problem, before any choice has been made, it gets a couple to make a statement that it is unacceptable to refuse to participate in a get when objectively it's needed. So the decision at the very beginning is made that we will participate. And that has virtually a 100% success rate, which shows the strength of making the choice at the beginning correctly leads to the proper outcome. Whereas when that choice is not made at the beginning, when the opposite choice is made in the beginning, it becomes habituated. And it applies in every area of life. How hard it is to reroot ourselves, and how easy it is to fall into the trap of continuing in the path that we have started, no matter how little sense it makes. Keshet says, my children know that while I don't like to reward bad behavior, I will reward my children if they start out an outing behaving badly and they're able to turn it around. Because from my experience, turning around is the hardest thing of all. And so if the story of Paro is to teach us anything, it should teach us the difficulty of changing positions mid-course, and the challenge of evaluating our decisions honestly early on. That's the way that we retain our freedom of choice. Because if we become habituated in something, we start to lose the ability to choose, the ability to change. The beginning matters. The first time I have to ask myself, is this the right thing to do? Is this who I am? And that's how we maintain our freedom of choice. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.